Welcome to Crown TV. Immerse yourself with a captivating audio from our stories. We provide an alternative way to read books in audio. We upload many audiobooks as possible, from bestsellers to timeless classic. Subscribe and stay tuned for new upload.
Episode 261. Hands Like Knives. Andy and Tim hid behind Rufus. They were deeply frightened, and they felt lucky to be alive. Rufus hadn't noticed that there were steel wires hidden inside the silk. Seeing that both Andy and Tim had been beaten back, he began to feel a little anxious. He turned to Paul. "Please deal with Mr. Marvel." Paul looked at Charles and then over at Alex. He knew who he really wanted to fight. A contest with Alex would prove once and for all who is the better fighter. "What's your name?" he asked. Paul respected skilled martial artists, and he prided himself on knowing everyone who was worth knowing. But he didn't recognize Alex. "My name is Alex," Alex responded with a stern look on his face. All he could think of was how Paul had ruined his wedding, and now he was going after his father-in-law as well. Paul was surprised. Of all the young fighters he could think of who had notable skill, he could not remember anyone called Alex. Then again, he had been training heavily for the past 12 years. He hadn't had time to keep tabs on every up-and-comer. "Rufus," Reginald suddenly exclaimed, "this boy's full name is Alex Ambrose." Given the influence of the Cliftons, Reginald figured that Rufus must know about the Ambrose family. Alex's lineage might prompt Rufus to back away. Otherwise, he might not only have Charles killed, but Reginald as well. So he's an Ambrose, Rufus thought and looked Alex over. Yeah, he must be. He carries himself like a rich kid. But it doesn't matter. Whoever he is, he's not going to stop me from killing Charles. This is a private matter, and the Ambrose family has no right to interfere. "That's not my name," Alex blurted out. His family had hung him out to dry. He wanted nothing to do with them now. Rufus didn't know what Alex was talking about, but he could tell from his face that he was telling the truth. But it didn't matter. Whether Alex was a true Ambrose or not, Charles Marvel had to die. "Mr. Novak, you have your orders," he said. Paul nodded in agreement and turned to Alex with a smile on his face. "It's a pleasure to meet you. You see, I've been tinkering with my own style of martial arts for the last few years. It's a kind of mix of everything I've learned in my life. I've been waiting for a real opponent to test it on." For the first 2 of the 12 years that Paul had worked for Jessup Clifton, he had felt stifled in his martial arts technique. But then he had started thinking about mixing all the styles he had been taught into something new. He had spent the following years perfecting his unique creation. But even though he was the Cliftons' first choice in matters of violence, his technique had not yet been tested against a worthy adversary. Until now, he thought, Alex will be my first real opponent. Paul's eyes moved leisurely away from Alex and fixed on Charles. He stretched out his hand toward him, and it seemed to transform into the shape of a knife. At the same time, he stood up straighter and moved to strike at Charles' head. Neither Charles, Lindsay, nor Debbie had any time to react to this move. But just as Paul was about to strike Charles with a fatal blow to the head, somebody took hold of his wrist and turned the blow away. Paul looked beside him and saw that it was Alex who had hindered him. He stared at him in disbelief for a moment, and then twisted out of his grip. His other hand came flying toward Alex with even greater power and speed. But before it could find its target, Alex stepped away and avoided the blow. He was amazed at Paul's abilities. It dawned on him that one mistake in this confrontation could be fatal. He had to focus. He took a deep breath, felt his internal force flow into his arms, and struck at the center of his opponent's body. Their palms crashed into each other like two slabs of concrete, and both of them were stunned. Alex hadn't expected Paul's defenses to be so strong. For a moment, he stood in shock at the fact that his hand was still attached to his arm. Paul was equally surprised. His initial blows were a technique he had perfected over years of practice. It was perfect. No matter what angle, strength, speed, or rhythm he used it at, it was impossible to guard against. And yet, Alex had done so. After the initial shock, Alex collected himself and rushed toward Paul. He hit him in the chest with his right elbow, just below the throat, and Paul gasped for air and almost vomited. He looked as if he was about to fall over. Alex chose not to follow up on this debilitating strike. Instead, he stood and gazed quietly at Paul. Paul shook his head and composed himself. He was extremely angry and disappointed. He had studied to perfect his skills for years. He had been sure that his technique would become a staple of martial arts training all over the world. It was his legacy. But it had failed him in its first real test. He refused to believe it. When he turned to look at Alex, his eyes shone with anger and a strong thirst for vengeance. Paul took a deep breath. Once again, he molded his hands into the shape of a knife, preparing to strike. This time, he sprang up and came at Alex with such speed that his arms seemed like the blades of a propeller. Alex stood back and assessed Paul's new technique. It was as if he had harnessed the power of a tornado. His blade-like arms spun and rotated so rapidly that there seemed to be a dozen of them. If one strike landed, it would be impossible to avoid the following barrage. Alex knew that he couldn't afford to make a mistake. He took a few steps back and focused. When he saw his opportunity, he struck in between Paul's whirring arms and hit him right in the face. Just when Alex's punch found its target, one of Paul's hands cut him across the belly. Somehow it ripped his clothes and left a shallow cut in the skin, as if his flesh and blood hands were really knives. If Paul had managed to reach a little farther, he might have opened Alex's gut. Paul stopped his attack and stepped back a few steps. His face was now red and swollen. It looked as if it hurt badly, but he didn't seem to care. It was his pride that had taken the worst beating. Suddenly, Paul cried out and came at Alex with 4 new attacks in quick succession. Each of these were different, but Alex was able to parry them with ease. They exchanged blows for a few minutes, moving up and down the hall and smashing furniture. Finally, Alex landed a decisive blow. Paul flew backwards onto the ground, slid across the floor, and lay lifeless a few meters away from Alex. Everyone was stunned, especially Rufus. He never thought that Paul would be defeated. Paul raised himself very slowly. His face was covered with blood and dust. His clothes were in tatters, and he moved as if his body was about to fall to pieces. Finally, he managed to stand up. "I lost," he admitted. "It seems I am no match for you." He nodded deferentially to Alex, as if to say he now understood how arrogant he had been. Alex ignored him. Winning or losing didn't matter to him. What he cared about were the lives of Debbie and Charles. "Mr. Clifton, please, take your people away now," he said and looked at Rufus. Rufus's heart was racing. He was truly afraid of what Alex might do to him. But he would not give up. Killing Charles might be impossible, but he still had to bring Debbie back with him. He wouldn't allow her to repeat Cynthia's mistakes. "Debbie, come back with me," he said. "I'm your uncle." Debbie looked at him with fear and disgust. David, Reginald, and the 4 Moon Girls were stunned with surprise. "No, Rufus," Charles said, and stood in front of Debbie. He thought that the Cliftons would kill her if she went back to them. "Please, spare her life." "What are you talking about?" Rufus asked. "Debbie's part of our family. Do you think we'd hurt her?" "What kind of question is that?" Charles couldn't believe what he was hearing. Cynthia had died because the Cliftons wanted Debbie dead. If she fell into their hands now, it was obvious that she wouldn't survive. Rufus snarled. If Alex hadn't been there, he would have attacked Charles without a second thought. "You heard me? Are you calling me a liar?" Episode 262, A Questionable Proposal. Charles and Debbie looked at each other. Neither of them trusted Rufus. "Debbie, come back with me. Your grandfather misses you very much." Rufus approached Debbie as he spoke. Alex stepped in front of her. He didn't know what Rufus might do. Rufus was displeased, but he was so afraid of Alex that he didn't dare to protest. He just looked at Debbie anxiously. "Debbie," he said, "don't you want to see your real home? Where your mother lived? Your grandfather hasn't seen you in 20 years. He misses you very much. Yesterday, I showed him your picture. I've never seen him cry like that." At the mention of her mother, Debbie was reminded what Charles had told her about Cynthia's death. Her anger erupted as she stared at Rufus. "You killed my mother! I hate you!" After this outburst, her eyes turned red and watery. She lowered her head and started crying. "What kind of people are you?" she whispered as she sobbed. "You were her family. Why would you kill her?" In Debbie's mind, her mother's death might be understandable if a stranger had been responsible. But it had been her own father, Debbie's grandfather. "What am I supposed to do?" she asked herself. "Kill my own grandfather to avenge my mother?" "Debbie, There were reasons why those things happened, Rufus answered. As you said yourself, we're family. We would never hurt you. Your mother was my sister, and I loved her. What does he mean by that? Debbie thought. There must be some secret, something he's not telling me. Will you come home with me? Rufus asked again, in a voice that sounded truly caring. You've been away for 20 years. If you go back and see your grandfather, he'll be very happy. Fine, Debbie answered calmly. I'll go back with you. She had made up her mind. She had to meet Jessup Clifton face to face and ask him what this was all about. That's great, Rufus exclaimed happily. We'll go back then. But you won't send anyone after my father again, Debbie continued. If you do, I'll never forgive you, and I'll avenge both him and my mother. She didn't trust Rufus. If she went with him, he might still send someone to kill her father, so that she would have nowhere to go. I promise, Rufus said solemnly after thinking for a moment. The only reason he had wanted Charles dead was to make it easier to take Debbie home. If she came willingly, there was no reason to go after Charles. Debbie, I'll go with you, Alex said. The 4 Moon Girls agreed. We'll go where Mr. Alex goes, Celeste insisted. Despite his fear of him, Rufus was very happy to have Alex come along. He would be quite useful if he could be made part of the family. However, when Alex reached out and held Debbie's hand, his worries returned. Alex, I'd appreciate it if you gave us some space. Alex, I'd appreciate it if you gave us some space. Alex was a little puzzled, but then he understood that Rufus felt threatened by his closeness with Debbie. He let go of her hand. Mr. Clifton, please understand. Today is our wedding day, and you're part of the family. I'd be honored if you'd witness our marriage. Yes, said Reginald, who saw an opportunity to relieve some of the tension. Alex, you should exchange rings and kiss each other again, and then you'll be officially married. No, Rufus protested. The Cliftons are a proud family, and we do things our own way. None of us can get married without the family's consent. Right now, that's impossible for you. I hope you understand. He turned to Debbie. Debbie, you can't marry him today. When we go back to Baltimore, I'll take you to see your grandfather and we'll see what he says. All right then, said Alex. Debbie, we'll go to Baltimore and talk with your grandfather. Debbie seemed to have been swayed by Rufus's argument, so there was no use arguing. She nodded in agreement. Rufus breathed a long sigh of relief, and then looked over at the other wedding guests. I'll remember everyone who was here tonight. If I hear gossip spreading about what happened here, or the things we talked about, it will be very bad for all of you. Understood? Yes, Reginald answered. Everyone in the room nodded in agreement. Rufus turned back to Debbie. Debbie, you go and rest. I'll meet you here in the morning, and we'll go back to Baltimore together. Then he signaled to Paul, Tim, and Andy, and the 4 of them left. Once Rufus had gone, Reginald, David, Charles, and Lindsay walked over to Alex and thanked him. David was particularly grateful that Alex had saved his life. "Thank you, Alex," he said. "If you hadn't been here, my father and I might have been killed." His eyes were filled with admiration. "Don't mention it," Alex said with a smile. Reginald was starting to feel as if his presence was unwanted, and that the Marvels must have a lot to talk about. He said goodbye to them, turned around, and left with David. "Debbie, do you really want to go back with the Cliftons?" Charles asked when they were alone. There was sadness in his eyes. "Maybe you should just run away from here." Debbie shook her head slowly and smiled. "Dad, they found me here. If I tried to run, where could I go? I just want to go to the place where my mother lived. Don't worry about me. I don't believe that Jessup would harm his own grandchild." Charles nodded his head in silence, but he and Lindsay both thought that what Debbie and Alex were doing was very dangerous. However, he realized that it was their decision to make, and he decided to give them some time alone to discuss it. He suggested that everyone else should go back to their rooms. Everyone went to get some rest. A room in the house had been arranged for the Moon Girls, and though they were reluctant to leave Alex, they also said goodnight and went to get some sleep. Alex and Debbie were finally alone. "So, we're going to see your grandfather tomorrow," Alex said and took Debbie's hand. "Are you nervous?" He saw that she was frowning, and he worried about her. "I don't know what I'll say to him," Debbie answered. She didn't know how to feel. "My mother died because of him. I hate him so much." "It's okay. I'll support you whatever you want to do." Alex gently pulled Debbie's hand toward him, and she rested her head against his chest. Her earrings scratched him, and he winced slightly. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Yes, I'm fine." He looked down at their clothes and smiled. "So, we've had half a wedding. I'm starting to think it's just not going to happen. Are we the worst couple in the world?" Debbie blushed. "No one's stopping you now. We can do whatever we want." Alex smiled at her and took out his ring. She also took out hers, and they placed them on each other's fingers. He stared into her eyes. They twinkled like stars. She had never been more beautiful to him. He slowly put his face close to hers and kissed her cherry red lips. It was the sweetest kiss either of them had ever had. It was like drinking the finest honey. And Alex felt as if he was soaring among the clouds. He slowly released her and looked into her face. He was blushing so hard that his entire face was scarlet. In her eyes, he glimpsed the possibility of endless joy and contentedness with life. Then, he suddenly felt an intense sense of pride that she was his. "Debbie, you're my wife," he blurted out. "Yes," she whispered and lowered her head. The whole idea made her feel a little shy. "And what am I?" he asked. She wanted to call him husband, but she hesitated. They were not yet married, and there was still her family to deal with. "You're Alex," she answered. "No," he said and smiled. "When I call you my wife, you can't just call me by my name." He knew why she was hesitating, but he felt he had to encourage her. In his mind, they were already married. His prodding worked. "You're my husband," she whispered. Alex happily agreed. He grabbed Debbie and lifted her up off the floor. "What are you doing?" she asked. She was startled. "Let me down." "This is what husbands do." Debbie laughed and cried for him to put her down. "Look at you all scared," Alex said and put her down. "Are you in a better mood now? It's getting a little late. Let me show you to your room, and then I'll go to the guest room." Alex accompanied Debbie back to her room and said goodnight. She lay down on the bed, thinking about how happy she felt when Alex spun her in his arms. She couldn't help but smile. When she turned over and looked at the other side of the bed, she fantasized that he was lying there. "Yes, we're already husband and wife," she murmured. She smiled and imagined she was talking to him. When she thought that they still had their wedding night to look forward to, she felt so embarrassed that she closed her eyes and tried to go to sleep right then and there. The next day, Rufus picked them up at 9 o'clock in the morning. Apparently, he had managed to replenish his security since the day before. Charles and Lindsay saw them off at the main gate. After they had said their goodbyes, Alex and Debbie got in the back of Rufus's car, while the Moon Girls got into another. They drove to the airport. Rufus had already made the arrangements. The flight left around lunchtime and arrived in Baltimore at 2 in the afternoon. When they got out of the airport, there were cars waiting for them. They were all set to go straight to the Clifton family mansion, while Paul was sent to stay somewhere else. Paul hadn't slept for the entire night, and he wouldn't stop shaking his head. His defeat by Alex had been a great blow to him. They drove for a long time through heavy traffic before they passed onto a relatively quiet street with trees planted on both sides of the road. The houses looked like they were all hundreds of years old. They were all black or red brick houses, and their worn-down facades bore silent witness to their long and fascinating histories. The car stopped in front of a tall, bright red door. On its surface was placed a large golden plaque that said, Clifton Manor. Episode 263, The Family Home. Debbie and Alex stepped out of the car and looked at the house in front of them. Debbie was struck by the realization that this was the place where her mother grew up, and that she would soon come face to face with the man who had caused her death. The thought of her grandfather Jessup made her agitated, and she couldn't calm herself. "Let's go inside," Rufus said. He walked up the steps to the door, opened it, and stepped across the threshold into the Clifton family mansion. Alex and Debbie followed him. Once they had gone through the first hallway of the house, they found themselves walking through a long corridor. It twisted and turned between the rooms of the house. After a little while, they came upon an inner courtyard. Its pathways ran in between decorative stonework and greenery. All around them were beautiful flowers, bushes, and small trees. Rufus ordered one of the men to take the Moon Girls to a room adjacent to the courtyard, where they could rest and freshen up. A middle-aged woman was planting flowers in the garden. When she saw Rufus, she immediately stopped what she was doing and came over to greet them. "Hello, Ruth," Rufus said casually. He gestured to Alex and Debbie. "These are new interns we've hired at the company. I've brought them here to discuss some things." The woman greeted them with a friendly nod. Rufus led them over to the other side of the courtyard, and they went further into the house, Alex could not help but feel that Rufus's behavior was strange. On the day before, he had no qualms about revealing Debbie's lineage in front of everyone. But now he was hiding it from his own employees. Of course, Alex remembered. Rufus also threatened the others into silence about what they had heard last night. I wonder how big this secret is. While Alex was trying to think things through, Rufus led them into a second courtyard. It was similar to the first in size and appearance, and the air was filled with the smell of freshly cooked food. They walked across the courtyard, and Rufus pushed open a red wooden door that led into a large living room. Alex and Debbie walked in after him. There was a table full of delicious food in the middle of the living room, and at the table sat an old man with white hair and a beard. His face was majestic, and his eyebrows were like sharpened swords. But he looked quite relaxed. When he saw Debbie come in, he gave her a stunned look, and his body quivered slightly. This man was Jessup Clifton, and when Debbie saw him, she froze. Despite her feelings about her grandfather, she felt strangely close to him. Rufus immediately closed the door and gestured toward Debbie and Alex. Please, sit down. Debbie and Alex sat down at the table. Jessup was in a heightened emotional state. When he looked at Debbie, it was as if he was looking at the daughter he had lost. Debbie, he said and stopped. He did not know what to say. After the strange connection she had felt when she had first laid eyes on him, Debbie's anger at her grandfather returned. Why did you want my mother dead? She asked, without really meaning to. Debbie, things aren't what you think they are, Rufus interjected. When that happened, your grandfather took it very hard. Do you really think he'd be so cruel as to arrange your mother's death? No one loved her more than he did. Jessup raised his hand and motioned to Rufus to be quiet. He looked at Debbie and said in a warm voice, Debbie, come and look at these photos. As he said it, he picked up a stack of photos he had held under the table and handed them to Debbie. She took them from him. The first was a picture of a man holding a baby. The man looked like Jessup, but he was much younger. The timestamp in the corner of the photograph said, May 24th, 1974. Debbie flipped through the photos. They were all pictures of Jessup and his daughter. From the way she looked, Debbie could tell that it must be her mother, Cynthia. A picture from 1977 showed her sitting on her father's shoulders, smiling happily. The next one was from April 25th, 1982. Cynthia had become a little beauty dressed in green and pink. She was standing beside Jessup and comparing her height to his. In a photo from June 4th, 1990, Cynthia was as tall as Jessup's chin. She was wearing sportswear and standing in what looked like a middle school playground. In her hands was a trophy that said, School High Jump Champion, and beside her stood Jessup. He was glowing with obvious pride. The last photo was from July 9th, 1994. By that point, Cynthia had grown into a beautiful young woman. She was holding Jessup's arm and resting her head on his shoulder. Both of them were smiling sweetly. From these photos, Debbie understood that Cynthia had a good relationship with Jessup Clifton all throughout her childhood. Looking at them, Debbie couldn't help but burst into tears. She wiped them away and looked at Jessup. "If you and my mother were so close, why is she dead? It's your fault." "Some things are out of our control," Jessup answered. "I admit that I was wrong then, but please, believe that I loved your mother too much to wish her any harm. I didn't expect such a terrible thing to happen." He looked at her with pleading eyes. "Debbie, won't you please call me grandfather?" His voice trembled as he spoke. Debbie didn't know how to feel. She had no idea what could have caused Jessup to do the things he had done, but she was starting to believe that he really had loved Cynthia. The photos were all the evidence she needed. "All right," she said. "Grandfather." Jessup broke into tears, and he bowed his head and tried to wipe them away. "Forgive me, my dear," he said. "I've been waiting for you to call me that for the last 20 years, and my wish has finally come true." Then he suddenly perked up, as if he had remembered something. "Come now, eat. I know that you've suffered outside all these years, but you're a Clifton, and you must be hungry. I didn't know what you like to eat, so I had the chef prepare a table of all of Cynthia's favorite dishes. Let's see if you like them too." Debbie took some casserole from the nearest bowl and put it on her plate. When she put it in her mouth, the flavor overwhelmed her. It was absolutely delicious. Knowing that her mother had loved it made it taste even better. "Please, grandfather," she continued. She needed to find out why her mother had died. "Tell me what happened to my mother. What happened between you?" Jessup Clifton sighed, and his eyes moved from Debbie to Alex. This was the first time that the old man had seemed to notice him, and Alex immediately sat up straighter to introduce himself. "Hello, Mr. Clifton. My name is Alex." "You don't have to be so polite, son. I know your family very well. Your grandfather Lincoln is a great man, and I've heard about you as well. I've heard you defeated Cliff Munson and Paul Novak. And so young, too. You have a bright future ahead of you." Jessup knew more than he let on. Since the day before, he had learned from Rufus what had happened at the wedding, and he had also learned that Alex had been cut off by his family. "My family has disowned me," Alex said. "My future doesn't involve them at all." "I can't believe that Lincoln Ambrose would throw such a promising young talent out of his family," Jessup protested with feigned surprise. "In that case, what are your plans for the future?" Alex thought for a second. "Mr. Clifton, to be honest with you, I don't know. Me and Debbie were supposed to get married yesterday. But Rufus said that when a Clifton gets married, they need your consent. That's why I'm here. You should know that Debbie and I already consider ourselves husband and wife, but we would like your blessing." Jessup looked at them both with hesitation, while Rufus looked nervously at his father. "Grandfather, I really like Alex. Please, give us your blessing," Debbie said. "Debbie, you've finally returned to us, and I'm very happy," Jessup answered. I can see that this young man cares for you. But I can't judge his character in such a short time. What if he changes his mind? Then it's you who'll get hurt." Alex and Debbie looked at each other. They couldn't understand why Jessup was so hesitant. "I think it would be best if I got to know you better first," Jessup continued. "Let's give it 3 years. If I decide that he's worthy of being my son-in-law, I'll be happy to approve your marriage." Neither Alex nor Debbie thought they could have heard him correctly. 3 years seemed like an unreasonably long amount of time. Jessup could see the doubt written on their faces. "We're a cautious family, and we have our own ways of doing things. We like to make these kinds of assessments over 3-year periods. If you're truly right for each other, it'll seem like nothing compared to the rest of your lives. Besides, you're still very young," Rufus added. "You should finish school and get married once you're out of university." Alex and Debbie smiled at each other. This comment from Rufus made the whole thing seem like a more reasonable request. "All right, I agree," said Alex, and Debbie nodded. "You're a bright young man," Jessup said with a smile. "I'm looking forward to having you for a son-in-law." "Grandfather, you haven't answered my question," Debbie reminded him. "I need to know why you pushed my mother so hard." Jessup's eyes darkened, and he shook his head. "I can't tell you right now. I hope you can understand." "No," Debbie protested. "Tell me. Whatever the answer is, I'll accept it." She clenched her fist under the table. "Debbie," Rufus cried, "you don't understand. All your grandfather has ever done is to protect you. You need to stop asking these questions, or it could be very dangerous. Not only for you, but for the whole family." Rufus's words took Debbie and Alex by surprise, and their curiosity mingled with fear. Debbie's mind was filled with questions about these people who were now her family, but she did not ask any more. She nodded silently at Jessup. "Thank you for understanding, Debbie," he said solemnly. He paused for a moment before continuing. "I still have something I must ask of you. From now on, you must never reveal your true identity, not even in front of other members of the family." Episode 264, Student Transfer. Debbie looked at Jessup in bewilderment. He had welcomed her back into the family, and now he was saying that she had to remain apart from them. She began to wonder if it was some kind of joke. "It has to be this way, Debbie," her grandfather said, "for your own sake and for the rest of the family." He reached over and patted her gently on the arm. "I will arrange for you to transfer to Johns Hopkins University so that you can complete your studies. You'll live as any other student, but I'll be watching over you. Nothing will ever hurt you again." Debbie was stunned, and Jessup seemed genuinely sorry for what he had asked of her. After a moment, he shifted back to Alex. "Alex, I'm counting on you to stay with Debbie to watch over her. Naturally, I'll pay you for your trouble. $1.5 million a year should suffice. Just make sure to never reveal who she is to anyone." Alex agreed. Even if Jessup hadn't paid him a cent, he would have stayed with Debbie anyway. "Good." Jessup said with a satisfied smile. "Now, let's have our meal. Debbie, please have some more." Then he reached for the nearest plate and put several pieces of meat onto all their plates. As they ate, Debbie was eager to try every dish on the table, and afterwards she felt very lucky to be having such a good meal with her close relatives. But once they were finished, she felt that there was one last request she had to make. "Grandfather, I would like to visit my mother's grave." "Of course," Jessup answered. "Rufus will take you this time. But you must promise not to go there by yourself after that." He turned to Rufus. "Son, be careful on the way there. Keep an eye out." They all rose from the table, and Jessup went over and stood close to Alex. "Alex, I must ask something more of you as well. Before you and Debbie are married, you must not overstep. Otherwise, you'll hurt Debbie and the family. I hope you'll remember that." Debbie and Alex were embarrassed at such an overt implication that they might sleep together. "Don't worry, Mr. Clifton," Alex answered. "I know the rules." "Debbie, you still have your mother's jade pendant, I assume?" Jessup asked, and Debbie nodded. "Good, it's yours. But you must be careful never to show it to anyone." "Yes, Grandfather," Debbie replied. "I promise." From the look Jessup gave her, she understood how important the jade pendant must be to the family. On their way back to the cars, Alex fetched the Moon Girls and instructed them to find a hotel in the city. Then he and Debbie walked back out through the front door, and Rufus took them to the cemetery. When they found Cynthia's grave, it was unkempt and overgrown. Debbie wiped the overgrowth away and cleaned the tombstone as best she could. She regretted that she had never been able to visit. She began to cry as she stood over her mother's grave. Rufus was sympathetic, but he warned her quietly to try to contain her emotions until she was in private. If anyone was watching, an emotional scene might arouse suspicion. They stayed at the cemetery for half an hour, and then Rufus drove them over to see the hotel that the four girls had booked for them. On the way, Rufus told Debbie that she should go straight to the university on the following morning. Everything had been arranged for her. Of course, it had all been done with complete secrecy. Nobody at Johns Hopkins would know the connection between Debbie and the Cliftons. For Alex's part, Rufus told him to go to the university and apply for a position as a campus security guard. As Rufus explained, it would be the perfect position for him to be at the university and watch over Debbie. When they got to the hotel, they went straight up to their rooms. Debbie was very sad after the visit to her mother's grave, and she went straight to bed to rest. Alex didn't want to disturb her, so he let her rest until they went to have dinner at the hotel restaurant. Debbie didn't say a single word throughout the whole meal, but Alex wasn't particularly worried. With the day she had had, it was no wonder she was in a solemn mood. After dinner, Alex asked Celeste and Celine to help Debbie get ready for bed. Half an hour later, they knocked on his door. Luna and Callisto were already with him. "How is she?" he asked them as he opened the door. "Don't worry, Mr. Alex," Celeste answered. "We drew a bath for her and got her into bed. When we left, she had already fallen asleep." "Good." Alex was relieved. "Mr. Alex, You must also be very tired, Celeste continued. You had that massive fight yesterday, and we never helped you relax your muscles. You should take a hot bath, and then we'll give you a massage. Okay, I'll take a bath. Alex felt a little sleepy. He got up, went into the bathroom, took a hot bath, and then came out wearing his bathrobe. He lifted it off his back and lay down on the bed, and the girls rubbed and pressed on his body. He closed his eyes and felt extremely comfortable. He could barely remember how uncomfortable he had been with the massages in the beginning. It had become almost an addiction for him. By the way, he raised his head and said to the girls, Debbie and I will be staying at Johns Hopkins University after tomorrow. I think it would be best if you bought a house in the city to live in, and then you should try to find something to do. When I have time, I'll come and see you. No, Celeste protested. We're supposed to serve you, Mr. Alex. Wherever you go, we'll follow. We've already thought about it. We'll also get into the university, and then we can see you every day. Alex looked at them. When he saw the determination on their faces, he knew there was no use arguing. He was deeply moved. It's not so simple to just get into a university. How will you do it? We'll spend a bunch of money to buy our way in, Celeste said with a smile. It should be easy if we approach the right people. Okay, said Alex. But you must do it yourself. If I do it, it'll look suspicious. Tomorrow, I'll go to campus and get a job as a security guard, and I'll contact you when I'm in. Then it's your turn. Thanks for the massage, girls. Now, go back to bed. The Moon Girls stood up and covered him with a bedsheet, and then they left. His whole body felt completely relaxed. He closed his eyes and fell asleep immediately. The next day, Alex and Debbie took a taxi to the university. When they got there, Debbie's eyes were filled with curiosity and excitement. She hadn't been sure what to expect, but the campus was teeming with activity, and the atmosphere gave her a burst of energy. Are you excited? Alex asked her with a smile. He was relieved to see that Debbie's sadness seemed to have gone away. Actually, I'm nervous, Debbie answered. With my grades, there's no way I could have gotten in on my own. It's only because of my grandfather that... Alex quickly put his hand over her mouth to stop her from saying anything more. He looked around to see if anyone was watching them, but nobody had seemed to notice. He looked at Debbie and said in a low voice, Remember what he said. No one can know about your relationship to your family. Be careful what you say. Alex had thought about it a lot. If Debbie's grandfather was so adamant that her identity be kept a secret, then there must be a very good reason. All right, Debbie nodded. Alex stroked her cheek and noticed that she had put her wedding ring on her index finger. He smiled at her. So, you're a bachelorette again, I see. Then he raised his own hand and showed her his ring. It was still on his ring finger. Well, I'm never taking this off again. They went to the student's administration office. Rufus had told Debbie that she only needed to report her name to the staff. Everything else had been taken care of. When Debbie gave her name to the administrator, she checked her computer and found Debbie's information. When she looked it over, she turned back to her with a stunned expression on her face. Oh, you've been recommended by Professor Chalmers at Richmond. And you've won first prize in a singing competition organized by the Washington, D.C. municipal government. Very impressive. Debbie and Alex didn't know what she was talking about. As far as they knew, there was no Professor Chalmers at Richmond. And Debbie certainly had never won a prize in any singing competition. Rufus must have made it up to cover up Debbie's real identity. The administrator asked Debbie to fill out a few forms, and then she handed her a couple of books. Right, we're all done. But you'll hit the ground running. You've transferred right in the middle of a semester, so there's no time to lose. Just stay on schedule and you'll do fine. Take these materials and go to the music building. Ask for Jordan Greenfield. That's your music teacher. You'll be taken care of. The administrator handed Debbie a few more pieces of paper, and then she went back to her own business. Alex accompanied Debbie out. I'll go by myself, she said. I noticed the campus security building earlier. Just back down the way we came. You should go and apply. Alex agreed with her suggestion. As she disappeared around a corner on the way to her music teacher, he walked along the corridor of the administrative building. In just a couple of minutes, he came across the door to the security department. He straightened out his clothes and knocked on the door. Rufus had told him that there was a vacancy among the campus security staff, and that he should go in and apply for the job. If for some reason he didn't get it, Rufus would straighten it out for him. When the door opened, Alex was met by the frowning face of a 30-year-old man. What do you want? He asked. I'm here to apply for a job as a security guard, Alex said with a smile. The man immediately stopped frowning and opened the door with an enthusiastic smile. Come in, he shouted giddily. The room inside was very long and separated into an inner and other section by a glass door. In the area just inside the front door, 6 or 7 uniformed men sat watching their phones. They all looked to be well above 40 years old, and every one of them either ignored Alex or glanced disdainfully at him. Come with me, the chief's in the back, said the young man. He gently pulled Alex along and pointed to a door at the far end of the room. Alex smiled and walked in beside him. They went through the glass door and entered the intersection, where the whole wall was filled with monitors. It seemed to Alex that one person could see every inch of the university from this room. A few more men sat watching the monitors. They also looked to be in their 40s. Once Alex got a closer look at them, he found that they were not watching the monitors at all. In fact, they were all asleep. One of them was even snoring. This is the boss's office, the young man said as he brought Alex up the door in the back. It had Security Chief's Office written on it. Thanks, Alex said to the man. Then he knocked softly on the door, and a voice called out an answer. Come in. Episode 265, A Sense of Security. Alex opened the door and found a man in his 40s sitting behind a desk. He was pale with short cropped hair, and he wore a well-maintained uniform over his thin body. His name was Tony Lewis, and he was the head of the campus security at Johns Hopkins University. May I help you, young man? He said with a smile. Based on Alex's age and appearance, Tony had thought that he must be a student. And most of the students at Johns Hopkins were rich and well-connected. Tony never talked down to them if he could help it. Alex understood immediately that Tony had misjudged him. Hello, sir. I'm here to apply for a job. Tony was surprised. In his experience, nobody applied for jobs in campus security unless they had no other options. His entire staff was composed of guys who had been on the job for 20 years or more, and new applicants were few and far between. That someone like Alex would show up seemed almost impossible. Tony might have been happy to have a young new recruit at his disposal, but the timing was terrible. Several workers had been in touch. They did not have the right qualifications for the job, but they were willing to accept a lower rate of pay. Their lack of qualifications didn't matter, as long as there were no other applicants. But now Alex had waltzed into his office. Tony needed to find a good reason not to hire him. The smile on his face disappeared. He leaned back in his chair and glared disapprovingly at Alex. Tell me about yourself. Alex was slightly taken aback, so he resorted to providing his basic information. My name is Alex. I'm 5'11" tall. I weigh 187 pounds. Yeah, all right then, Tony interrupted. He thought for a moment before continuing. Alex, I don't think you're a good fit. Thank you. Alex didn't understand. He was young and healthy, and a much better fit for the job than anyone he had come across on the way in. There's something going on here, he thought, but I have to get this job. Please, sir, reconsider. I really want this job, he pleaded. Oh, really? Tony answered and looked questioningly at him. I bet you think you'd be great at it, too. But why can't you find a job somewhere else then? You saw those men out there. We've all worked together for a long time. We know each other. I don't need some kid to come in here and mess up our routine. What Tony was saying was half true, but there was also the money to consider. I won't make any trouble, I promise. But that's not up to you, is it? You won't fit in, and you'll destroy the unity of the whole team. Tony grew impatient. He needed some other way of making his point. He stood up, opened the door, and gestured to Alex to follow him. Come and meet the team. If they don't object, then I won't either. When they came out of the office, the men watching the monitors immediately sat up straight. They looked at him with fear in their eyes, as if they expected to be fired at any moment. Tony simply smiled and browsed the room. Then he pointed at Alex. This kid's here to apply for a job. What do you think? Should I hire him? The other security guards knew immediately what Tony wanted them to say. This was his usual procedure for getting rid of unwanted candidates. He expected them to help him turn Alex away. I don't think so, one of them said unconvincingly. Kids these days don't know what having a job means. Tony, please find someone else, another one chimed in. I don't think this kid's cut out for it. He'll just give the rest of us more work. A third man came up and patted Alex mockingly on the shoulder. Look, kid, security's not a good first job straight out of high school. Why don't you go work in a juice bar or something and let us do our thing? Everyone in the room started laughing. You heard them, said Tony. You seem like a good kid, and I'd consider it if anyone thought it was a good idea. But they don't. Now, get out of here. We've got work to do. Hold up, Chief, a voice called out from across the room. I think he should stay. Tony's smile disappeared as he looked in the direction of the speaker. It was the younger man who had opened the door for Alex. "What's that, Don?" Tony stared angrily at Don Landers. "I think we should give him a chance," Don repeated. "If you need someone to work with him, I'll do it." The other security guards looked derisively at Don. It was clear that they didn't like him. Tony was still staring at him with an ice-cold gaze. "This is what happens when you hire people who don't belong." "Well, Don, I know when I've made a mistake. You're fired. Please leave by the end of the day." Don was gobsmacked. He hurried over to Tony, grabbed his arm and said anxiously, "Tony, please don't fire me. My sister still needs me to earn money for school. I can't do it without a job." Tony sneered at him. "I gave you a chance, didn't I? It's not my fault the job doesn't suit you. Now, let me go." Tony couldn't get out of Don's grip, so the other security guards took hold of him and pulled him away. Then they escorted Don and Alex out of the building. "Are you okay?" Alex asked. Don was pale and sweaty. He didn't seem to be handling the situation very well. "Let's get some air." Alex helped him out of the building and sat down on a bench in front of a small pond. "Sorry," Don said. "I'm anemic, so sometimes I get lightheaded, especially when I get worked up. I'll get better if I sit for a while." He seemed to be getting better already, and Alex felt relieved. "Thanks for sticking up for me." "That's okay," Don answered. "It was mostly for my own sake. The other guys are older than I am, and I've only been there for a few months. They treat me like I don't belong. But if you were there, there'd be two of us. But now I guess there's none." He smiled bitterly. "If you have anemia, aren't there better jobs out there for you?" Alex asked. "Not really. I've tried being a hotel waiter, a valet, and a truck driver. I almost drove into a ditch once. Working security's actually easier, and my illness doesn't affect me much, so I ended up here." "What about you?" he asked and turned to Alex. "You seem healthy enough. It can't be hard for you to find a job. When you do, maybe you could help me." "I want to work here," Alex said and shook his head. "Well, that's not going to happen. Tony only hires people who will take lower pay. The competition's too great." "That's not necessarily true," Alex said with a smile. "You just need to know how to compete. Stay here and rest for a while. I'm going to the bathroom." Alex rose and walked out. He stopped underneath a tree, took out his phone, and found Rufus's number. Meanwhile, Tony had returned to the office and sat whistling with his feet on the desk. He was in a very good mood. He had gotten rid both of Alex and Don, and now he sat fantasizing about the money he would save on one of his cheaper new hires. Life seemed very good. He took out his phone and opened the photo gallery. It was filled with the pictures of women he had chatted with online. His favorites were the college girls. As he scrolled through the photos, he imagined taking them to fancy dinners at hotel restaurants. And then he thought about bringing them up to a hotel room to have some fun. Just as he was getting lost in his fantasies, the phone rang and scared him half to death. He sat up and gathered his senses. Then he answered. "Hello? Who is it?" "My name is Rufus Clifton," a quiet voice said. Tony shuddered and broke into a cold sweat. His hand began shaking, and he almost dropped the phone. He had lived in Baltimore for over 10 years, and he knew about the Cliftons. He knew about their wealth and influence, and he had heard that Rufus Clifton handled underground operations all over the city. Maybe even all of Maryland. What could such a man possibly want from Tony, the insignificant head of campus security at a local university?
Thank you for listening to Crown TV. Please don't forget to subscribe, share and turn on the notification button.